Okay, it is 3 o'clock, so we will get started. Welcome to the fifth Navigating Publication session. This one is called Scholarship as Creative Work as Scholarship. And this is our second session for the spring. We will have one more. Mark your calendars. OSU Press is sponsoring a coffee hour that is focused on inclusive publishing processes. And that will be at the same time, 3 o'clock Eastern on April the 16th. So be sure to come to that. It will be a good session. So as we were planning this session, we talked a lot about the different ways that we understand ourselves and our work in the context of both scholarship and then the different creative work that we all do. And at some point I asked folks to send me some nouns. Let us all know about the other ways that they describe themselves aside from formal academic titles. So I'll use those as I introduce everyone. Hi, I'm Krista Kennedy, by the way. I'm a writer, a photographer, what I would call a culinarist, which is not an actual word I claim. And I'm an associate professor of writing and rhetoric at SU. Also with us in alphabetical order is Kevin Browne, who is a doer of things, a Moss man, a Bois man of the mind, and associate professor of writing and rhetoric also at Syracuse. Cara Finnegan, who is a writer, a sometime photographer, a curious person, and professor and associate head of communication at University of Illinois UC. Steve Katz, who is a Ciceronian poet, a musician, and Pierce Professor Emeritus of Professional Communication, and also Professor Emeritus of English at Clemson University. And Elaine Richardson, who you may also know as Dr. E. She is a performance activist, memoirist, and professor of literacy studies at Ohio State University. And before we get going, I also want to thank our folks behind the scene because they're the ones that really make these sessions go. They make the gears turn. And they are Jim Malkowski, who's our outreach officer, Jeff Clegg and Eric Detweiler, who are our digital communication officers, and of course, always Kathy Cisa, who has handled all the registration for this. So our general plan is a panel conversation for 30 to 40 minutes, as always, and then Q&A for the remainder of the time. So if you have a question, please ask it. Use the Q&A queue function, please, so instead of the chat, because that way we'll be able to manage your questions better and make sure that we get to them. So Erica, is there anything else we need to say? You've already let us know probably also about closed captioning being available, and you can click on that if that is something that will be beneficial for you. So when we were planning, we talked a lot about the process of coming into the academy and becoming academic by doing all the very academic things that we're asked to do along the tenure track, publishing in academic genres, coming to understand oneself of some sort of an authority, and then also trying to find your way through the process of becoming yourself within the academy, which is separate. So I thought we might open by talking a bit about what's that been like for you and how has that process manifested in terms of creative work? So Kevin, you might get us started with this.
You went with the alphabetical thing. Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Krista, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And so great to meet everybody, people that I have known for a long time and people that I've only just met. It's been really exciting. For me, I think it's a very interesting time because as I've gotten more advanced, I suppose, in age, but also in the profession, I've also taken a great deal of freedom, not academic freedom necessarily, but artistic freedom with the work that I create. And I don't think that it's so much a consequence of any particular kind of angst with respect to my relationship with the field or academia in general, or even scholarship. I think it's really just a consequence of the work that I've been trying to do. So I see my artistic practice really as an understanding, an applied understanding of rhetoric, of Caribbean rhetoric, of cultural rhetoric, of ethnic rhetoric, but of Caribbeanness, of my Blackness and my maleness. So as I've worked to articulate these different things, I've found it necessary to use these different modes to make my articulations possible, you see? So I remember when I was in grad school, my dissertation director, Keith Gilliard, always said that, rhetoric is the art of the probable, and for me, that has always meant working to devise greater possibilities on their way to becoming more and more probable, right? And because I theorize, having come from what I would say is an impossible people, people for whom our existence was never part of a plan. Yeah, our continued existence was not part of a plan. I'm theorizing and I'm practicing a response to impossibility by crafting spaces for probability and for things to happen, and not just metaphorical things, right? So I'm playing around with metaphor, and I'm trying to do this while playing and theorizing and living and suffering and loving through material practice. Does that answer the question a little bit?
I think so.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to pick up from there?
He's so good. I don't know if anyone wants to follow. I will, as the dinosaur of the group. So for me, it's always been a juggling act. I was a musician first, and then a poet, and then a scholar last, and maybe that's even questionable. But there was a real conflict, especially when I got into graduate school and then the doctoral program. I don't know, maybe there's some people in the audience who struggle with that, but there was so much to do that I didn't have time to write. In my second year in the program, the poetry dried up. It just dried up, and so I took the summer to write short stories that have never been finished or published, or one has, but and then on to the academic career at NC State and then at Clemson. Sometimes they were in creative writing and academic writing were in conflict. As a matter of fact, I was told at tenure time that if I didn't, or near tenure time, if I didn't produce a book of scholarship instead of publishing poetry, that I wouldn't get tenure. This was a very conservative person in the department on the literature side. But this is juggling. Sometimes those things are in dialectical relations. So my reading the ode for the Penn State Conference on Rhetoric and Composition at its 10-year anniversary helped lead to the publication of The Epistemic Music of Rhetoric with SIUP Press, and they kind of, I see the two as dialectically related, and then that led to things, and so there's that relationship. And now that I am retired and writing full time, obviously, I get to integrate the two kinds of writing together, although there's still pieces I'm working on that are very separate. And also as the Pierce professor at Clemson, I got to do more integration at conferences, at panels. I turn them into plays. I turn them into performances. If anyone's interested, I can talk about it. But and people, I think some people thought I was insane. They're actually probably right. And then, but some people saw what was, why I was doing it and what was going on. And likewise, publications in enculturation, multimodal publications in enculturation, a long piece on my retirement in introspection just recently. I'm pursuing it, but it's still like juggling. And then sometimes the muse comes at the most inopportune times. It could be 5 a.m., which I'm still up. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a night owl. And it could be while I'm if I had used to have papers to grade and this poem would strike me and I'd spend the whole day writing the poem. So they were clearly in conflict, and I came up with this phrase: poetry breeds irresponsibility, at least in traditional terms. Because if I'm inspired to write something, I'm not putting it down to grade papers. I grade the papers, with copious comments, but at another time. Yeah. So anyway, that's my story.
Dr. E, would you like to jump in?
There I am. Wow, Kevin and Steve gave me so much to riff off of. Wow. Well, the process of coming into the academy was me trying to hide who I was. I came out of the street life, out of sex work, out of abuse, out of addiction. And I just knew that I didn't want to go back where I came from. And so that second time when I came back into the academy as an undergraduate with 2 kids, and then I had another one while I was as an undergraduate. But it was a process of being okay with who I was over time and not feeling like I had to hide it. But of course, like Kevin said, he's a Black man, right? So certain stuff you cannot hide, right? I couldn't hide it. I was a Black woman. And until I opened my mouth, you didn't know that I was from the ghetto, that I spoke Black. I won't tell you what my teachers called it, but that I spoke Black language. And it was a while before I really even knew what Black language was, other than something negative. And that was as an undergraduate student. Eventually, this professor, because I was struggling in every writing class that I took. And eventually, this professor told me that I needed to read Talking and Testifying: The Language of Black America by Geneva Smitherman. And when I read that book, it gave me an academic identity. It gave me something that I thought I could do, because it turned me on. It was something that I used to be ashamed of, but it made me not be ashamed anymore of my language. So it's definitely been a process of coming into knowledge of myself as a Black woman, linguistically and other ways as well. But something that Steve said made me really think about when he said his poetry dried up. I struggled so hard to learn how to write academic discourse that my Black voice, I know it was there, but I was always trying to cover it. So when I started trying to write like I talk, or write so that people could feel it, I had to work hard at that again, like in writing. So singing, talking, no problem. But writing, it's like, damn, I'm still doing this, formulaic academic discourse, and I don't want to. I want to, I want my damn voice back, So, yeah, so, because nobody can do it like Geneva Smitherman. I'm just sorry. She's just the best of, both worlds with writing, profound ideas in Black language, and also mixing it with academic discourse. So it's been a process coming into my creative voice, and also writing my memoir, and trying to get my memoir published, because I wrote PhD to PhD, ho ho to PhD, How Education Saved My Life, in Black language. And it was very hard to get that book published. So I'm I might have to tune in to the workshop where you said OSU Press is going to talk about being inclusive, because wasn't nobody trying to include me when I wrote. That's why, you know, thank God for Steve Parks, who, you know, had his own press and who hooked it up through Parler and through his press, through New Community Press, that I was published. But I don't want to talk too long, so I'll pass it on to somebody.
Yeah, that's what's happening. That's cool.
Yeah.
I can say a couple of things about, I think that connect with a few things other folks have said, you know, and Steve, you started out talking about how you began as a musician. And when I think about my trajectory, I think about how I was a writer and a kind of maker of visual things first, before I went to graduate school. And I think that was a way that I was able, often unsuccessfully, but attempted at least, to kind of integrate the creative side with the academic norms, which are very much there and ever present, and frankly present for some people more than others. And that's, I think, something that we all need to recognize for sure. You know, when I started graduate school, I remember my dad was actually a journalist, and I sent him a paper that I had written in my first semester in my master's program. And, you know, this was sort of before we were all even doing email, so I'm dating myself. But I got it back, and he had read it, and he had put a yellow sticky note on the front. And he said, and my dad was a very terse sort of facts man person. And he said, it just said, "Dear Cara, this is very good, but problematize is not a word." And I kept that sticky note. I wish I still had it, because my dad is no longer here, but that has stayed with me. And you know, by that, what I saw him saying, right, he was doing his kind of journalist thing, but there was also a little bit of you're starting to write and talk differently, and you know, I'm not sure how I feel about that, and these fancy words you're getting maybe aren't always words, right? And that stuck with me. And you know, I think one of the things, you know, as I thought a lot about these really great questions that Krista has posed for us, and that we talked about in setting up this panel, one of the things I thought a lot about is, did I set aside creative interests? Did I integrate them? How did I do it? And I think the answer is I did both at the same time. I think I definitely set aside certain ambitions and certain questions and ways of working that I'm now returning to, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I also feel like the good thing I did or tried to do was I tried to find a way to bring my creative impulses into the academic work, so that the norms didn't feel quite so much of a struggle, I guess, if that makes sense. So what are ways that I can bring my creative curiosities and energies to the things that I'm studying that need to produce these kind of more traditional products? And for the most part, I think that's been successful. I have sometimes made choices that, you know, would not quote unquote count for tenure or promotion. And knowing that was, you know, the situation I was in my particular position, that was just a thing I knew. But the times where I did it anyway was always a good idea, you know, and so I think about it in that context as well.
You know, and I think you saying that leads us naturally toward one of our other questions. So panelists, I'm going to jump the question order here. Where we were talking about the fact that creativity and creative processes are still applicable to academic work. It's not like the two things are just absolutely divorced, although, you know, the tenure process tries to tell us that they are. You know, creative work informs academic work, and academic work is itself creative work, which is not something we're often told in graduate school. So do we want to talk a little bit about how that has played out for you, how these two parts of your identity inform each other and propel each other?
Should I go first again? No.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve. Take it.
No, you take it. You take it. You
Okay.
actually, I think, are one of the most successful in doing this because of the things you actually create, the materiality isn't just a theory for you. I mean, you work with materials.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to hear more.
Yeah, I think in terms of my engagement with sort of like producing the work, how do I put this? Let's see, I see it as a practical engagement with my own thinking about metaphor and symbolism and that kind of stuff, right? So I'm thinking of ways to make meaning material, right? If right, so instead of coming from the ethereal aspects of my intellectual practice, which requires a certain kind of discourse, which is like academic discourse on a certain level for a certain audience, I try to see if I can filter those meanings in a way that would begin to have things coalesce, right? So whether I'm working with materials or trying to craft something, I'm still using the language of making, right? So I'm trying to see if I could then justify what I've done theoretically by what I create practically, you see? So I see it as a kind of dialogic relationship between things that I make. So my wrist right now is hurting because I was working on a piece this morning, right? I was kind of like polishing a hoe blade. But then I was also thinking about how do I write about this? And the reason it's important for me is not because I see a particular value in one or the other. It's not a question of hierarchies or anything like that. For me, it's a question of versatility. So when I think about rhetoric, I think about having this rhetorical toolbox of multiple methods that I can use that I have at my disposal. My relationship, as I said, is not based on angst. It's not, I was writing poetry when I was in Marine Corps boot camp, and getting punished for that. So I was always sort of like committed to some kind of artistic inquiry, right? But when I got into graduate school, I realized that this is my exposure to another language. So academic discourse is an opportunity for me to deepen and expand my multilingual experience, but only as a means to a particular end, right? To the end that I can communicate more effectively with my people who look like me, people who sound like me. I should say that, Dr. E was one of my professors when I was at Penn State. See, so her choices, and she was working on PhD to PhD while I was still at Penn State getting ready to get out. You see, so I saw what she was doing as a practice of academic freedom as I understood it, because academic freedom is artistic practice. Artistic practice is humanistic inquiry, right? So it just makes a really neat loop for me that made real good sense. And I said, well, all right, if Dr. E is doing that, then it's giving me the impetus to follow up on the work that I was doing for my dissertation. My dissertation only had 1 or 2 code switching elements in it, but it begins with a story, you see? So the beginning of that story in the midst of a carnival, myself painted in blue, was how I wanted to situate carnivalesque discourse in the academy, right? And once that got published, I was like, okay, so there is a space for this, but I didn't know how much space, so I had to go carve it out, yeah? And the more I carved, the more I looked, I didn't see people who sounded like me. And I think part of why is because a lot of the people who sound like I sound, who code switch, who use these different vernaculars, have been sort of like browbeaten into not using their languages effectively. So the work that I'm doing is necessarily resistance work. Yeah, it is necessarily the work that says, okay, maybe the academy does not want me, but maybe I need the academy to do the work I want to do. You see, and working out those sort of kinks, working out those sort of conflicts means that I now get to articulate something that is extra academic, not outside the academy, but beyond it. You see, so the way I situate myself is not necessarily going to be in relation to promotion right? Like Cara mentioned earlier, you know, I've been to a number of different institutions because I was chasing meaning, not tenure. I left Syracuse in my 4th year. I had passed 3rd-year review. My book was already published, but I know that I wanted to do something else. I wanted to do something that was not being viewed as valuable enough for tenure. I was told, you know, work on the articles and work on this and that, and whatever. And I was like, yeah, I got you. And I will, but I got this thing that I got to do. Yeah. And this thing that I got to do demanded my attention. And as a result, I now make demands on the things that I make in order to practice that more effectively. Yeah. So by the time I got back to Syracuse, you know, I got promoted and that kind of stuff. It was not because I was chasing the tenure clock or running, you know, trying not to have the publish or perish clock run out on me, right? It was for me a very real consequence of just stuff that I figured that I had to do, right? You know, and you know the expression, don't follow me, I'm lost. You know, I don't think I was lost. I don't think I was lost, but you know, don't follow me. You got to start carving your own path. Yeah. You know, carve your own path. And this is the work that is gonna for me stand the test of time, because it matters and it makes matter, right? And it's not just playing around with these words just for the sake of playing around with them, right? Is jargonistic if you want, but you know, it's also part of this national, I mean, not national, but natural unfolding of my discourse, right? So I see it as just part of how I do this thing that I do. Does that make any sense?
Mhm.
Fantastic,
Absolutely
actually.
does.
Yeah. So I'll just say something about versatility. I kind of went in a different way. So the creativity, of course, and the poetry evolved, but I wound up, the versatility came out in the number of fields I work in, which is kind of insane. You know, not only professional writing, not only scientific writing, but Hebrew rhetoric. Um, you know, and things I've even repressed. Um, but I should say, in every field I work, there's a doppelganger. There's another Steve Katz who's also working. I'm serious. Even as a musician, there's Steve Katz from Blood, Sweat, and Tears, right? So who plays bass, which is one of my favorite instruments. So, you know, it came out that way, and I've stopped being troubled by it. But you know, it's easy to stop being troubled when you're semi-retired. I won't say I'm completely retired. Just did a doctoral defense yesterday. Yeah. So you did it. I mean, you did it by carving. That word is real. That metaphor is really significant for you, Kevin, because literally as well as figuratively, you carved your place out.
Yes. Yeah.
I was squished and then stuff came out.
Yeah.
Because the versatility came out the other way, you know.
Yeah.
So I just throw that in.
I also think about these kind of, I guess maybe what we could think about as micro practices. I in the context of, you know, thinking about how you bring a creative sensibility to academic work and what that means, or how your creative work comes out and connects to your academic work. And for me, a lot of that is in the context of writing. And probably 15, maybe almost 20 years ago, I asked the folks at our graduate college, do you have any sessions for graduate students on writing, on scholarly writing? And at that point, they didn't. The whole kind of graduate student professional development landscape is really wonderful and has changed a lot. RSA has actually had a really important role, I think, in that. But what I wanted to do, and what I did, you know, in some workshops, was just to kind of say, you know, if you're a scholarly writer, you're a writer and your work is creative. And what would it mean for you as a person, maybe as a graduate student, toiling away, feeling lonely and isolation in this world where academic norms may be a more or less ominous kind of felt presence, what would it mean for you to think of your work in that way? And part of the reason I think I did that was because I needed to think about that myself, right? We often offer others the things that probably deep down we need as well. But what was really interesting to me about that was, and I called it a micro practice, not in the sense of saying it's unimportant, right? But just in a kind of daily habitual small thing. One of the things that experience, doing those workshops with graduate students from all over campus, really, I mean, there were computer scientists, I remember, in the room, was just to see that moment where you could sort of see they were this, and then they just went a little bit wider, right? And something opened up for them. And what that ended up being, I don't know. And I certainly couldn't take credit for whatever it is that they did with that. But just for me, that idea of, I think having someone else, all of you are mentors, right? We're constantly, especially working with junior colleagues in particular, and just having somebody say to you, it's, what if you thought about it this way instead, right? Or what if you did it that way? Or what if you said, I'm a writer? Like, what would that do for you?
Mhm.
That to me has been really personally empowering to kind of let myself do those things for myself, but even more so, I've kind of become a little bit of an evangelist in wanting to encourage other people to think about those things themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point, Cara. Like when I thought about doing, for example, High Mass, the second book, I've said this publicly, that it was a book that I wrote to be read aloud. It's a book that I wrote to perform, you see. So I enjoyed writing it and reading it aloud in different venues, reading it aloud to myself. But more importantly, it stood as an example for students who might be interested in this kind of work. I figured that I wasn't going to be a very good evangelist because I think maybe sometimes I talk too loud, sometimes I talk too fast, sometimes I'm a little bit passionate, I got that Aries energy, right? But then it's like, okay, here's this book that has been accepted, published by an academic press. It has been sort of like recognized in the very terms and using the very frameworks that we're taught to value, you see. So in a way, it becomes kind of like one of the coins of the realm, but it does this alternate work at the same time that, has images, and it doesn't analyze the images. There's no effort to explain what the artistic work does, you see. Most of it is written in memoirist language, you see. So I'm playing around with the lyric essay, and I'm doing this very, very deliberately, very deliberatively, and I'm authorizing the reader to view it in such a way as well. So I don't know how good a mentor I am for students who are interested in this kind of work. So I use the artifact, the book, the object, as a means of persuasion, to get them to think about the work that they would like to do, and to do it better, to have a better response to their rhetorical situations than I have had to mine.
Dr. E, do you also want to talk about the way performance works for you?
Oh my God, they just been dropping so many gems. There are just so many gems. Oh, yes. Well, I think when I wrote PhD to PhD, I had no idea that, people told me afterwards, when a friend of mine, Dr. Mary Weems, wrote a play based on my book. And I, of course, I improvised and added my own thing to it. And that was the way that I got around the country with the book, was performing a one-woman show based on the book. But people started telling me, I learned so much about other people's fields of inquiry or scholarship from doing it because of different audiences at, different venues. So one thing I learned about was arguments around sex trafficking, because I was calling myself a child prostitute. And the scholars told me, they say, oh, no, 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 no. There's no way that a child can be a prostitute. You were trafficked, right? And so I learned that from people, coming to my talks and talking to me. And that got me to, into, okay, let me read some of this literature so I can find out more about that. I also found out that people said, oh, this is an autoethnography. Y'all said, oh, okay, it's an autoethnography. To me, it was a slave narrative. I thought it was like a neo-slave narrative or my, urban memoir. But some people told me, they said, no, this is a neo-slave narrative. So I was learning, different things as I went around the country and meeting and talking to different scholars and different groups of people about what it was. It's interesting that we talked about things that don't count, because without going into a lot of detail about it, it doesn't count in certain spaces. Like the work that I was doing didn't count. I had to make it count. I had to make a case for the work that I was doing to count. Because it was not being counted. And I was doing like double work. Like Kevin said, when you're writing, creative writing, you're not explaining what you wrote. You're showing it in what you wrote. But I had to write articles about the stuff that I did, academic articles, to prove to people that it was scholarship, that it still counts. So, in a way, there was just so much that I was learning through doing that I wound up doing double work. And I wasn't getting double paid either. But one of the breakthrough moments for me, even though I didn't do it at that time, was I remember being a graduate student at Michigan State. And this woman, I'll never forget her name, Indisha Ida Mae Holland. She was a playwright and she won, I can't remember what she won, but I know she was a renowned playwright. And her play was called, I think, Up from the Mississippi Delta. And she talked about being raped when she was, I don't even know if she was a teenager, but very young. And how in the South at that time when she was growing up, that any white man could just drag you back behind the bushes and have their way with you. And she said that's how she started, selling her body, because that was like what happened to her. And one of the civil rights workers, when they were coming down there trying to register Black people to vote, just took her with them. And that's how she got in the civil rights movement. And so her play is about her journey from, being this, very vulnerable young Black girl to becoming a major poet and a professor at University of Minnesota, and in the civil rights movement. Her play, I mean, when she talked at Michigan State, I just was weeping. I was weeping because I was like, there is somebody with a story similar to mine who is telling, and nobody's laughing at her. People are engaged. People, respect her, what she's been able to do with her life and her story. And I knew then that I was going to write my book one day. I'm going to write my book one day. I'm going to write my book one day. And so she encouraged me, but it took me a long time to get to the point where I could write the book. I actually waited until I was a full professor before I actually wrote it. Did I answer your question? Did I answer the question, Chris?
I think you did. Thank you. Looking at the time, I want to turn toward the Q&A queue. And if you have questions, keep sending them in. And some of your questions are very similar to questions we have for ourselves. And I'm so glad that you've helped us refine those, because there's the question of, how do you know when to be brave, right? Nothing in academia tells you it's okay to do this sort of work. You have very practical concerns about job market, especially the job market as it's been shaped by the pandemic, about the fact that you have a job but you're carrying debt. There are all the other practical concerns of getting tenure. When is the moment to be brave? How do we navigate career junctures like dissertations and tenure and the labor of trying to justify the work that you're doing? Because, I mean, Dr. E has made a really huge point here is that if you do this work, then you also do the work to justify the work, which is its own other job that you do.
Yeah.
What advice do we have about this? You guys think about it. I'll very briefly mention how it worked for me.
Please.
Because I was on very early in the tenure track, starting to put together a book proposal. And I had started to think about academic work as creative work, which was really the only thing that helped me keep pressing on and feel like I had some ownership in what I was doing, because I had started out as a creative writer and a journalist and then came into the academy. And then at some point in the dissertation realized that yes, this was still creative work I was doing. It just looked very, very different. And I remember having a conversation with Gwen Pugh, who's of course on the RSA board now, and she's a brilliant scholar, but also a romance novelist. And she had very generously given me her book, a copy of her own book proposal, just to show me what one looked like. And I was like, Gwen, how did you do all this other publishing? And she was like, honey, I waited for tenure. And in my case, I did need to wait for tenure because it took all of my energies to write a tenure book, which was what was required. But I was still photographing. I couldn't put that energy into writing, but I could put a lot of it into photography. And because I made that work public, it started to get picked up and published. So my tenure case did actually have, I wouldn't say hefty, but there were more photographs in it than there were actual academic publications. The academic publications counted for way more, but I'm still very happy that there was, a creative section in my tenure file. So part of it for me was finding another way, another outlet that was, in terms of creative energy, very different than the work I was doing in the academy. And then once I had tenure, and my friend Minnie Bruce Pratt, who used to run a Maymester section and created nonfiction that filled up instantly, every year said, you're going to take my class. And I was like, no, I got to write a book. I got to do stuff. And finally she said, I'm retiring, and this is the last one I'm going to teach. And I have saved you a seat, and your butt's going to be in that seat come May. And when Minnie Bruce tells you to do something, you do it. So I did. And then I started working on other creative work that actually is writing. So that's the process that I went through. And it seeped into my academic work, a lot of which starts with narrative now or includes narrative at some point in it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a fairly safe route with maybe a little, tunnel through it that helped me feel like I was still me and doing the work I wanted to be doing. But I wonder, how has it worked for the rest of you? What advice would we give to someone who, is in a precarious position and trying to figure out how to be true to themselves, do the work they want to do, and still do the work the academy asks you to do?
I liked Kevin's phrase, using the academy to do what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
That stuck with me. I just wish I had done it smarter. I don't think, I feel now that, I've made a lane for myself, and, I'm okay, but I don't think I did it the smartest way. Because like I said, I was doing double work.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have the mentoring that I needed, I think, to be able to work smarter earlier.
I've been thinking about this from a kind of institutional perspective. Whether you're on the tenure track or whether you're in what my university calls a specialized faculty or non-tenure track framework, a lot of universities are rethinking what they variously call, public engagement. And a lot of the kind of work that we're talking about here and that folks in the audience may be thinking about from their own lives, performance, creative works, et cetera. A lot of that is second nature to our colleagues in other fields, right? Like that is their research. Dance is their scholarship. This is how it is. But there is this zone of so-called public engagement, which might incorporate a lot of what it is that we're doing. And, so I've been on a task force on our campus, and one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we help, not only how do we value and then create reward systems, excuse me, that's hugely important, right? How do we create reward systems so that not only are people not doing the double work, but they're actually getting a reward for the work that they're doing that is valuable, right? That we can call public engagement. So how do you do that? But then there's this whole other process of educating the people around you. So, you know, a university can create a document that says, you know, it's great if you do this and this. It's great if you, you know, are a published poet and, you know, you're a rhetoric scholar. But if your department head, if your college, if the executive committee, right, that's reviewing your promotion on whatever track you might be on, isn't clued into the values, that's a challenge. And so, you know, there's the kind of individual level of like, how do you work this out for yourself?
Right.
But then there's also the, how do the people who have a little bit more power, like those of us who are tenured, right, do, how do we try to create paths that maybe weren't there for us? So that perhaps, right, like the goal of what we're doing on our campus, and I don't know whether it will succeed or how it will play out or how it will be received, frankly, by people here. You know, the goal is to make space to value the things that people are already doing, right? The point isn't that this is like new. The point is that people are already doing this kind of work. They're merging their creative and academic selves in all these different ways. So why don't we actually take a cue from them and see what it is that we can do to value and reward that better? So I'm hopeful, but you know, it's challenging. Institutional change, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a word, because like for me, even though I've done this work and it has in a way paid off, you know, now, because I get to say, well, yeah, I'm an associate professor and at Syracuse is tier 1, and you know, if you want to do this kind of work, come hang out with me, right? Or just reach out to me if you're interested in this kind of thing. The risk initially was so great that I was not going to be viewed as anything but an outlier. I did not see people doing the kind of work that I wanted to do. There were no avowed Caribbeanist scholars in rhetoric. You know, like I was so happy when I found out that Dr. E has Jamaican heritage, right? I was like, yes, you know, and then we would code switch in the hallway and that kind of stuff, right? But then when I proposed the notion of Caribbean rhetoric to my committee in grad school, they were like, I mean, yeah, I hear you, but can we say there is such a thing as Caribbean rhetoric, right? One of the committee members had asked. And aside from the personal insult of, you know, suggesting that there is no such thing as Caribbean rhetoric, is the more interesting question of how do we say that there is such a thing as Caribbean rhetoric, right? I didn't have the privilege of saying, well, we're not represented. Me and my people are not represented in the academy. I had to now go and represent. I had to go do that pioneering work of representing, of what Dr. E said earlier, of doing the work to justify the work you do, right? So that became the first book. And this is something that I would recommend for students and younger scholars, junior scholars, or whatever we're calling them, as they navigate the promotion gauntlet, right? Which is, you work on the work you need to do in order to do, you know, it's kind of like the gladiator thing, right? I do what I got to do so I can do what I want to do, right? And it's very simplified, but when you think about it, it isn't that deep. You use the language to help you understand what it is you need to do, to help you enable you to do it. But also, if we're thinking about rhetoric and we're thinking about composition studies, we're thinking about helping the institution by meeting them where they are, right? You meet the institution where they are because that is part of your discourse community, whether you like it or not, right? And the nature of an institution is to promote its own existence, to promote its own status quo. That's just what it's going to do, even if it enables some change, even if it invites some kind of flexibility. The fact of the matter is the institutional work is within a particular lane, right? I'm not trying to see if I could destroy the road. I'm just trying to say, okay, here's a different path. And if this different path is useful, how do I get there? It means thinking about the versatility of like Steve's comment, right? The versatility of the discourses at my disposal, right? So it doesn't mean that you subscribe necessarily to an institutional culture. It means rather that, at least for me, it is an opportunity to shift and meld and mold based on the panoply of discourses that I have at my disposal. It means viewing my subjectivity as sort of like self-evident and taking that for granted, and then performing accordingly. So that way I don't feel silenced by a particular clock. I just work in relation to it. I take the risks that enable me to do this pioneering work because I've already justified it for myself that the risk is worth taking. You know?
Yeah. I'll just add one quick dimension to this. I had, before graduate school, before even the master's degree, I had promised myself as a creative writer that I would at least return to this in later in life, knowing that I would be changed. And I think because of that, I took myself with me. And one of the things that I did in very practical terms, of course, it was with a 3-3 load then I had, but I would teach, it had to do with what I taught. And I sort of bent department norms in that way. So I would teach technical writing, and then I taught creative writing, poetry, and then the history of rhetoric, all in the same semester. And I kept doing that. And but what happened was it still, the poetry didn't count as much. Even the published poetry didn't count as much, but it made it more normal for me to have it because I taught across these departmental disciplines through these courses. And I was lucky because of the people around me. When I went to Clemson, of course, I was invited. This is a different thing, but I was told, keep it narrow, keep it narrow. And by then it's sort of like I had a job, so it's like, no, I'm going to be who I am, And I started with the Hebrew alphabet, went to poetry, and then technical writing, and how all those were related. And it's like, you take me as I am. Here I am. Here it is. And if you don't like it, I'm going to stay at NC State. But see, that's easy. It's like retiring.
Yeah.
That's easy. Or being an associate, or even like Dr. E, getting tenure. It's a little relief off the shoulders. And, I had to do the double and triple time, Dr. E as well, to get tenure and still be creative, always doing a lot. Yeah. So, but also teaching a lot of things. I just wanted to add that practicality in, because that's something a little bit more in the culture of the department and in your control, if you can, teach in those courses.
Yeah. In the 7 minutes we have left, a couple of questions have been asked about what venues might one publish these things in. How might one legitimize this work based on sources, based on venues? And I think there's a moment here for some very practical advice about that, because there are a few places that you can publish. I mean, Dr. E has mentioned, was it with New City or was it with Parlor? New City?
Yeah, New City Community Press, which is in collaboration with Parlor Press.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
There's also a new journal called Writing, Craft, and Context that Asia Martinez, Sandra Tarabosia, and Michelle Iadisi are editing. That's looking like a really, really interesting venue. Duke has a creative nonfiction series Ohio also has a creative nonfiction series. Where else do we know about? I will speak, I'll be audacious and also speak for some of Steve's work, in that, I mean, just by nature of the fact that I'm writing about disability and technology, that medical humanities and medical narrative journals have also been a venue for me. And disability studies itself has a long tradition of publishing creative nonfiction and publishing poetry and other creative work.
Yeah.
And I haven't explored that yet because I've been finding my way into disability studies, but I'm thinking about venues like that for this sort of work also. What other sort of practical venue related advice might we offer someone?
Another place might be qualitative inquiry. It's a journal. I have a number of colleagues who have published their memoir-like pieces, autoethnographies, and that's a place that tends to be very receptive to a lot of those genres that are making scholarly arguments in a different way.
Yeah, I can also add computers and composition digital press.
Mhm.
Has been pretty receptive to multimodal work. Yeah, and for my second book, High Mass is done by Mississippi, University Press of Mississippi, through their kind of like Caribbean studies, nonfiction, and photography lines. So I was able to sort of like meld that project and get it done through them. And they also do really beautiful books, right? Which was really important to me. So when you're thinking about a creative venue, if you're using photography or visual representations of your work, the quality of the print matters, right? So all of what we're doing, we can call it creative, right? We can call it theoretical, practical, I mean, whatever adjective we wish, is at the base of it, rhetorical as I understand it. So it's important for me to not think about rhetoric just in an adjectival sense, but as an actual noun, a thing that we can behold and be held by it. So looking at how these books are presented, looking at how these projects are produced has to matter. So don't just hit the venue just because it's accepting of work that you're interested in, but it's got to produce the work that is consistent with your vision for how that work ought to be produced. You see, because that has to be a part of the trajectory of the work, right? Its production in the world, how it lives in the world or online. Yeah, so give some critical thoughts to all of these venues and hold them accountable if they are not satisfactory. You are in a position, and it is in fact incumbent upon you to actually demand better, because this is also how we justify the work. We justify the work by demanding better of venues, so they're not just throwing together some hastily constructed website because we feel like we want to do digital work. They're actually doing the work. They're investing time and energy and money, resources to provide spaces for us to do the work that we want to do. So when we do create it, they're ready to receive it. If not, then we push and we raise the stakes for them, or we go somewhere else. Sometimes that may mean outside of the academy. All right. So that too is a choice and a risk that you're going to have to weigh. You're going to have to gauge that, and you're going to have to operate accordingly. So that's something that I would add to the conversation of venues.
Mm. For those of you who haven't seen Kevin's book, I mean, it's a beautifully produced book. It's really almost a coffee table book of scholarship. And it wouldn't be the same thing if it was on cheap paper and in black and white. So I think that's important advice. And Cara, I know this is also something that you've thought about in the scholarly work that you've done. I mean, your first book was with Smithsonian, better than with a more retcon studies press. So we are almost out of time here. Thank you all for being here.
What?
People, and for really engaging in the discussion. Thank you for all of you who have taken time out of a Friday afternoon to be here with you. You know, and if you have a question that we didn't have time to get to, feel free to email me or Kevin, and our other panelists may be also open to being communicated with. And we're wishing you all the best of luck in your work. Rhetoric is a rich, rich field. We have, as Kevin pointed out in the discussion we had earlier, an embarrassment of riches available to us to do fine work. And so we're wishing you the very best of luck as you move forward.